Okay, so I'm going to share my screen and we'll continue with some of the things that we say when a child has trouble talking. So instead of ignoring it, we do want to acknowledge it. It's really, really important. So the first thing we want to do if a child's words get stuck or something's hard to say is we want to simply acknowledge it by saying, that was really hard to say. And then we reassure them, sometimes words get stuck and that's okay. And then maybe validate. It's hard to talk sometimes. So when we do this for kids, it's a huge relief for them because suddenly we're paying attention to something that's causing them frustration in the same way that we would if they're tying their shoes. Now, another misconception is when people say, don't worry, he'll grow out of it. Don't even worry about it. I know he's stuttering, but that happens to everyone. He'll just grow out of it. That's a fine bit of advice. However, stuttering does also seem to coincide, the onset of stuttering coincides around the same time that the child has some active pruning or fine tuning of brain functions. So whatever gets set up during this time can persist. So the difference between a child with persistent stuttering who learns some helpful ways to navigate stuttering versus a child who is left to cope on their own, we can end up with two different trajectories. So if a child is left on their own to cope, they will have the tendency, if a word gets stuck, to physically push. And if they start to physically push, that's when you start to see struggle. And so that kind of behavior, while it's not real helpful, it will persist. And so that child is going to end up with more struggled speech. And so it's a lot harder later on to rewire and re-navigate so that they can stutter more naturally, more easily. A child who gets the support during those early years can have persistent stuttering where their stuttering happens a little more naturally, and then the person who's listening to them barely even notices because they're not noticing struggle, they're noticing what you're saying. And so the best chance of recovery for most kids is between the ages of 3 and 5 years, while this fine tuning of the brain function is still occurring. So our goal is to provide education and support so that the child and the parent can know how to talk about stuttering, to create an atmosphere that's acknowledging and validating of the things that are difficult for that child, and then also to help the child learn to cope in ways that are more helpful than they would otherwise if they were left on their own. So the research in developmental stuttering, so versus actual persistent stuttering, is that for kids who go through that developmental stuttering phase, usually it occurs between the ages of 18 months and 4 years. And it always coincides with a period of rapid language growth. And that's why it varies. So for some kids, when they start to talk early, that developmental stuttering phase is going to start earlier. And if they're a later talker, then that developmental stuttering is going to start later for them. And the big difference between developmental stuttering and persistent stuttering is it only lasts for a few weeks. So we're talking about 12 weeks, that's about 3 months. So when we see a child who's been showing these disfluencies for over 6 months, that is usually a risk factor, and we want to make sure that they get treatment. Now, another misconception is when people will just tell a parent, oh, she's just thinking faster than she can talk, which is true in some cases. However, it's based off of a theory and a model of stuttering persistence that is called the demands and capacity model. And this model implies that the child's capacity for language exceeds their motor capacities for talking. And so the idea is that if we increase the demands for fluency and for communication that's greater than what the child is capable of, then that's how they persist with stuttering. And I think that it is appropriate for explaining how developmental disfluencies work with kids, and that's that in between the 18 months, 3-year-old phase. But once a child is about 4 years old and they basically have the capacity for language, and unless they have some other kind of motor speech problem, they also can talk as fast as they can think. So this is a fine model for explaining what happens during that developmental phase and that rapid language growth, but it doesn't explain why people stutter. So the things that we do tell parents, in keeping with the demands and capacity model, is to, when a child is showing signs of disfluencies, whether it's persistent stuttering or not, good advice could be to help the parents by requesting that they avoid rapid fire questions. So too many questions, when they're just firing questions at them, can create a bit of a time pressure for the child. So we like to reduce that. The other thing that we try to help parents with is to reduce interruptions. And interruptions are interesting because it doesn't mean we're just interrupting the child in the middle of communication, but interruptions can also happen when a child is talking and the parent or whoever's listening to them jumps in to respond so quickly that the child wasn't really finished talking. And that also can create unnecessary time pressure. So we tell parents to pause longer before they respond. And usually what happens is the child talks more. And then another advice we give parents is to slow down their speaking rate. So rather than telling the child to slow down, which is not helpful, we ask the parents to slow their rate. And what happens is they often result in sometimes shorter sentences and just slower pace. And again, we're reducing the time pressure. So things that we do not want parents to do is finish the words that the child's trying to say because they know what they're trying to say. We don't want to tell them to slow down because that doesn't help and it just frustrates the child. And we definitely don't want them to take a deep breath, because what happens when we tell them to take a deep breath is the child starts taking these breaths when they're in the middle of a sentence, and it just adds to struggle. So let's talk about the childhood stuttering screening for physicians. So this is what we want to practice today. Now, the CSS-P, it's designed primarily for physicians, but anybody can administer it. It's for kids between the ages of 3 and 5 years old. It consists of 7 questions, and it's designed for anybody. Whenever a child has concern, then we would like to have health professionals administer these questions. And it's very quick, takes less than 5 minutes. It could be questions that can be included in case histories, in medical records. And we do have a copy of that we provided for you. You should have that for this class. So one of the first questions on the CSS-P is if there's a family history of stuttering. Now, if there's a family history of stuttering, you can stop screening at that point and refer them to speech pathologist. However, I would still advise that you finish asking all the questions anyway, because whatever information you can gather can be helpful when you're making that referral. But because we know that there is a genetic link to stuttering, and if there's a family member who stutters, it's more likely that the child will also have persistent stuttering. So as long as there's a family history, we're going to refer regardless of how they do on the rest of the questions. The rest of the questions, though, is about, when did it start to occur? So we want to find out the time since onset. We want to know about the level of concern the parents have had. We want to know the types of disfluencies that they had. We want to see if they observed any physical tension or struggle when they were talking, or if the child expressed any frustration. So sometimes they will say it, but sometimes they don't say it. So if you see physical tension or struggle, even if the child didn't say, oh, that was hard to say, then that shows that they have awareness. And if there's an awareness, we would put yes to that question. And then if the way that they would be qualified for a referral to a speech language pathologist is if they answer yes to 4 or more of the questions on this screener. So that's how you'll know. In this way, it doesn't leave it up to guesswork and observations that don't always give us the information that we need. So what we're going to do next is we're going to have you go into breakout rooms in pairs, and you have a copy of the screener and you already did your case study outline. So we want to take turns with each other and ask the questions from the screener and then get the results. And when we come back, we're going to briefly discuss and wrap up, and then we'll talk about your assignment.